Hi, everyone. This is Daniel Pink from my home office in Washington, D.C. It is a pleasure to be with you for World Book Day, and I am so grateful to my friends at Cheers Publishing for this opportunity and for publishing this collection of books. What I want to do very briefly is give you a quick summary of these books and then maybe tell you what they might have in common, because I don't think that's obvious on its face. So one of the books in this collection is A Whole New Mind, and that book, which came out more than a decade and a half ago, talks about some changes in labor markets around the world that are putting a premium on one kind of skill and actually making another kind of skill less valuable. And the metaphor that I use to describe that is our brain. Our brains are divided into two parts. There's the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. Now, there's a lot of unscientific stuff written about left hemisphere and right hemisphere. It's very complex, but we do know that our brains specialize. The left hemisphere specializes in tasks that are logical, linear, sequential, analytical. The right hemisphere specializes in tasks that are more holistic, more about context rather than text, more about synthesis. And I think that metaphor is apt. I think what's happening right now, thanks in part to technology, is that the skills that used to get you into the white-collar middle class, whether in the United States or in China, were characteristic of the left hemisphere: logical, linear, sequential, analytic skills. Today, those abilities are still essential, there's no question. But they become relatively less important, and a different set of abilities, artistry, empathy, inventiveness, big picture thinking, those kinds of abilities are becoming more important. And this is actually a pretty seismic change in what it takes to earn a living around the world. And so this book looks at why this is happening and then some skills that we might need to deploy. Now, what's interesting about this book is looking at it in light of the revolution in artificial intelligence, which I think is making is giving us some clues that automation can possibly be done on some of these right hemisphere tasks, which I think actually elevates the kind of creativity and the kind of synthetic thinking that is going to be necessary. So another book in this series is called in English Drive, and it's about the science of motivation. And what it says very simply is this: that we have 50 years of research showing that a certain kind of motivator that we use in organizations, what psychologists call a controlling contingent motivator, or what I like to call is an if-then reward. Those kinds of motivators, if you do this, then you get that. Those kinds of motivators are extremely effective for simple tasks with short time horizons. They work extremely well. But the same body of research tells us that those kinds of motivators are less effective for more complex creative tasks with longer time horizons. And again, in much of the workplace, not all of it, but in much of certainly the white-collar workforce in the United States and in China and in the rest of the world, those more conceptual, creative, long-term thinking jobs are the ones that matter the most. And so what we have is a misalignment between our motivation system and what people are actually doing in the job. So this book lays out some principles for how to do that more effectively, particularly paying people well. It's incredibly important, paying people well, and then offering them some autonomy, that is, some sovereignty over what they do and how they do it and when they do it. Some mastery, which is the opportunity to make progress in meaningful work, to get better at something that matters, and then also purpose, which is knowing that what you're doing somehow makes a contribution to the world, makes a difference to other people. So that's the book Drive. That was followed by To Sell is Human, which is about the changing dynamics of the workforce again, but in this case, talking about why more and more jobs all over the world involve selling, influence, and persuasion, and how we're taking on those tasks in a fundamentally remade landscape because of changes in information. For a long time, if you were selling or persuading, the seller had an advantage on information. There was what's called information asymmetry. That is, the seller had more information than the buyer. But now that has changed, and that has actually changed the nature of selling and persuasion today. And so this book looks at some of the science behind them. What does years and years and years of behavioral science tell us about how to persuade and influence effectively and ethically? And it turns out that there are some very interesting abilities that are necessary there. Things like attunement. Can you get out of your own head, see things from someone else's point of view? Buoyancy. Can you stay afloat in what is often an ocean of rejection if you're trying to persuade. And then finally is clarity. Can you go from accessing information to curating information, to making sense of information? And can you go from very reductive problem-solving skills to more holistic, creative problem-finding skills? So that book lays that out. And finally, last and certainly not least, is the latest book, The Power of Regret, which looks at this emotion that I think is fundamentally misunderstood, the emotion of regret. When we look backward on our life and say, if only I had done this, or if only I had not done this, things would be better. And this is a powerful emotion, and as I mentioned a moment ago, quite misunderstood. We tend to think that regret is something that we should avoid, that if we feel those pangs of regret, we should just move on, forget about it. And science tells us something different. What it tells us is that regret is a fundamentally human emotion. It makes us human. It also can make us better if we actually confront our regrets, look at our regrets, examine our regrets, analyze our regrets. They can be a powerful engine for moving forward on a whole range of professional and personal tasks. I also looked at what do people around the world regret. We now have a database of over 25,000 regrets from people in 134 countries, including many in China. And what we found is that around the world, people seem to have the same four kinds of regrets. They regret not doing the work and therefore compromising their foundation in life. So spending too much and saving too little, not taking care of their health. They regret not taking chances. Over and over again, people seem to regret what they didn't do much more than what they did do, particularly when it comes to acts of boldness. There are moral regrets, so I didn't do the right thing, and then there are connection regrets, which are about relationships. And I think what's interesting about these regrets is that they give us a kind of a reverse image of what people want out of life. Around the world, I don't think it's that complicated. What do we want out of life? We want some stability. We want a chance to learn and grow. We want to be good, moral, just, and we want to have meaningful relationships. And so this emotion that we often tend to avoid actually gives us a window into what makes life worth living. Now, so these are 4 books with very different kinds of subjects, but I think a few things unite them, and I'll talk about those very briefly. One of them is the importance of examining our assumptions. In much of our lives, we spend with certain premises, certain internal beliefs that are never actually really voiced. So, for instance, take motivation. Our internal, our default, our hidden assumption is that the best way to motivate people is to reward them for what you want them to do and punish them for what you don't want them to do. And there's some truth to that, but that's not universally effective. And so examining our assumptions about who's in sales. We tend to think that only people who have sales in their job title or on their business card are in sales. But actually, if we examine that, we realize that all of us in some fashion are in sales. So one theme is the importance of examining assumptions. I think that makes life worth living. I think it makes you more astute in whatever you're doing. The second thing, though, is that once we examine these assumptions, what do we use to come up with something better? And there, I think we have to go with science, with evidence, with facts, with data. It's not enough to say this assumption doesn't make sense to me. You have to say what's going to replace it. And what's really amazing is that throughout the world, there are these extraordinary scholars doing extraordinary work, extraordinary work on all these issues of the human condition, about how we behave, how we decide, how we figure out what to do, how we make sense of the world around us. And if one takes the time to go wide enough and deep enough into this research, you can begin to come up with alternatives to those assumptions. So challenge assumptions, look at the science, and then apply the science to real life. This is actually important. It's not enough, in my view, for readers, if I'm as a writer, to say simply, here's what the science tells us. I think what we have to do is go the next step and say, here's what the science tells us, and as a consequence, here's what you should do. Here's what the science tells us. Because of that, here is 1 or 2 or 3 things you can do differently in your life. And so there is a sort of a chain here where we challenge assumptions, we use science to do it better, and then we apply that science to our real lives. And to me, that that's the kind of book that I want to read and it's the kind of book, consequently, that I have tried to write. And I think the final thing that I would add here is that what's very interesting is that ultimately, when you get this advice, it comes down to some very fundamental human qualities that are truly universal. One of the things about writing for so long and having the privilege of being published in China, thanks to Cheers, but also other places around the world, is that for all of the superficial differences, there's a lot of commonality. There's a lot of commonality in what it means to be human. And so the more we reflect on that, the more I think we can work smarter and live better. So it's been a pleasure to be with you through the magic of video. Have a great day, and thanks again to Cheers and to all of you for this opportunity.